I want to tell the story of how General Andrew Jackson was fresh off his latest massacre when he got the assignment to lead an army of lawyers, whores, Choctaw braves, and black guys to save America from destruction, along with a gang of pirates. So I was really excited to say that, but we should back up and talk about the history. In about 20 years after George Washington had basically stopped being president, he decided that he was only going to do 2 terms. The country was in a little bit of trouble because King George III and his son, who I call 4G, decided that they wanted to pay themselves back for the losses that they had in the revolution. So they lost a bunch of money on this revolution. They'd just been fighting Napoleon. So they sent a bunch of ships to the east coast of America, just in international waters, to basically pirate goods from American boats, and anyone with a British accent they would conscript into the British Navy. So this was obviously very annoying to the newfound republic, and so Thomas Jefferson, who was the president at the time, he had a solution to this problem, which was just to ban all imports and exports, which immediately destroyed the economy. Historians say this is maybe one of the dumbest things any president has ever done. Thomas Jefferson was very good at writing declarations of independence. It turns out not very good at trade or international affairs. So he destroys the economy, and then we're out of money. So to deal with that, he says, well, let's privatize the military now. So get rid of the military. All that budget money goes back to the government, and this turned out to be a problem when the British then invaded. They burnt down the White House. They sacked all these cities up and down the East Coast, and from Maryland to Virginia. And meanwhile, all of these American companies that survived off of trading goods in international shipments, their goods rotted on the wharfs, and the economy was doing terrible, basically. People started starving, companies started going out of business, and the British were fine. So what happened basically is, this has never happened in America before or since, but everyone basically flipped out of each other and they took sides. The Democratic Republicans burnt down the newspapers of their Federalist rivals. The Federalists were like, let's join the British. And so it was this sort of horrible situation that happened just after this new country had started. And this is around the time that King George III and 4G said, hey, maybe we can actually take this land back. So the country's in shambles, everyone's mad at each other, they're super broke now, and they have no military. And so they decided to do it, basically. So they looked at the map and they said, hey, we've burnt down all these cities, taken over most of the East Coast. All we got to do is sail up the Mississippi River, and we can push the Americans into the Atlantic. So this is one of those things that in American history class, we learn about the Revolutionary War, and we learn about the Civil War, and there's like one line that the history teacher usually says, and there was a war in 1812. But this is the story of what happened in the War of 1812. The British decided they were going to push the Americans into the Atlantic, so they had sacked all of these cities. The North was ready to join the British already, but there's one thing standing in the way of this plan, and it's a little town, sort of a raucous town, at the mouth of the Mississippi River called New Orleans. So this was the spot that they had to get past in order to go up the Mississippi and do the land invasion to take over America. So while everyone in the United States were suffering from kind of this poverty that the import-export ban had happened and all these people in all these cities had been sacked, while that was going on, New Orleans was throwing this big party. This is actually a picture of me and my friends in New Orleans. I'm there on the right-hand side. I'm like a cop from 1979, I think. So that was Halloween. So they're doing this while everything else was happening. And this is thanks to some local heroes known as the Pirate Brothers Lafitte. So this group of pirate brothers was keeping New Orleans in this nonstop party. These are them. So this is Pierre Lafitte. He ran the blacksmith shop where they would smuggle goods in and then distribute them to the city of New Orleans. Lots of rum and fine silks and rugs and all sorts of things. There was Dominique Lafitte, who was the guy that would sail around the Caribbean and pirate boats and take the goods to be smuggled into New Orleans. And then there was sort of the PR guy, the face of the pirate brotherhood, Jean Lafitte. So I know that this is what he's supposed to look like if we're going with movies of pirates, but when they make the movie about the War of 1812, this is who I want playing Jean Lafitte. It's Ryan Gosling. Anyway, Eric knows I'm a big Ryan Gosling fan. So what was happening is these pirate brothers were basically keeping the city full of rum, and the rule was that you were actually legally allowed to plunder any ship in international waters as long as your country was at war with them. So the British, when they started plundering these American boats, they weren't at war, and then they declared war, and so then it was legal. So these pirate brothers, they actually didn't refer to themselves as pirates. They called themselves captains and privateers because they sailed under letters of marque of Cartagena, which is a city-state that was conveniently at war with everyone. So they were at war with everyone, so they could legally plunder these boats. But then the problem was getting the goods from New Orleans, or from the ocean, basically from the Caribbean to New Orleans, required them to import stuff, which was illegal at the time. So what they would do, they had this little set of islands that they would basically dock their ships at, and then they would row the goods through the swamps, and they would mysteriously appear in New Orleans, and everyone was having a good time, partying, drinking rum. So this is going on while the British are taking over America. And as long as the pirates kept the city in rum, they left them alone. So they sort of turned a blind eye to this. But Jean Lafitte, being the smart and handsome man that he was stockpiling cannons and flints and tinders just in case they ever came for him. So the British army assembled this enormous armada, the largest armada ever to set sail to sea. And they had just defeated Napoleon, so they're feeling pretty confident about this. And they took a look at the map, and they said, well, we have to get up the twisting curves of the Mississippi River, and we have to knock out the New Orleans defense, basically, if we want to make this plan work. So they couldn't get their ships up the river very quickly. So they said, let's do a ground invasion. We'll knock out the defenses, then we'll sail our ships up, which meant that they would have to kind of go through this swamp and sneak attack the city of New Orleans. So British have about 20,000 troops and all of these ships. So they park the ships outside of New Orleans, ready to put the troops and sneakily get through the swamp to take over New Orleans. And that's around the time that the colonel of the British troops, the he that's in here, Colonel Nichols was his name, he paid a visit to Jean Lafitte and apparently his dog, and offered him $2 million to help them sneak through the swamp so they could surprise attack the city of New Orleans. And Jean Lafitte, being a pirate, said, yeah, sure, I'll take your money. And then they went back to the Armada ready to get ready for the surprise attack, and Jean Lafitte immediately double-crossed them because he was a pirate. So he went and he told the government of New Orleans immediately this plan that the British were going to sneak invade, and which obviously everyone freaked out about. But this was interesting timing because the state government had just declared war on the pirates. So the state was upset that the pirates were doing these illegal imports and that the city of New Orleans wasn't doing anything. So the governor had just barely declared a $500 reward for the capture of Jean Lafitte. And Jean Lafitte, being cocky and sexy, he posted up handbills all around the state for a $5,000 reward for the capture of Governor Claiborne. So this pissed off the government. And so they sent a crew to basically raid their little pirate island where they were importing all this stuff. I'm going to get to the point of this soon. But at the same time, they were double-crossing the British. All the pirates were hiding their shit in the swamp from the government. And what happened around this time is Pierre Lafitte had actually been captured. He had been arrested as part of this government raid. He mysteriously escaped from prison around the time that Jean Lafitte told the government about this British plan. So you can kind of see what's going on. He traded the information for his brother's release, and then the pirates disappeared. So they said, hey, the British are coming, we're out. Hid all their stuff in the swamp. So the new president of the United States, Madison, he freaked out because the country is going down the tubes, the British are going to take over, and they had no army, there's no military. There's only one person he could call. And this was a little-known militia commander who had been busy basically harassing and murdering Native Americans and sort of clearing out Tennessee for the settlers, basically. A controversial figure named Andrew Jackson, who, like the pirates, was also a complicated fellow. He had recently attempted to kill his own governor for some insult, and he just massacred a bunch of natives, and in a strange twist, adopted an American Indian baby. Very complicated, strange guy, as strange as the right word to use for him. And he was called to go lead some sort of defense of the city of New Orleans. And he was nursing a bullet wound at the time when he got the call, because the story is crazy. He'd been shot after trying to horsewhip some dude. I had to put it up there so I could kind of remember, who'd gotten mad when his friend shot that dude's friend in the butt. So we can go over this again to make sure the sequence is clear. A guy mooned Andrew Jackson's buddy. So Andrew Jackson's buddy shot him in the butt, and that guy's friend got mad. Makes sense. So Jackson then horsewhipped that guy for being mad, and that guy shot Jackson in the arm. So anyway, Andrew Jackson shows up to the city of New Orleans with his arm in a sling and diarrhea, because he has dysentery. From the journey, I guess, in those days. I don't really know how to spell dysentery. No one does. So he shows up, and the situation is not good, because all they have to defend the city from these 20,000 British troops are 200 local businessmen, a contingent of feisty local whores who'd signed up for ammo duty, and he brought with him 1,800 Tennessee hunters. They called them dirty shirts. These guys had never really fought a war, but they were hunters with these long, slow rifles that had kind of been part of these Indian skirmishes. There was also a platoon of free men of color who hadn't been paid in a while, but they were part of a local militia that had been disbanded, and he offered to pay them if they joined up. There's a crew of Choctaw Braves, 62 American Indian Braves who, for some reason, were willing to help this guy and these people who had been, kind of treating them badly. And Andrew Jackson promised to pay them, and he gave this rousing speech where he said, I know we have our differences, but let's set aside those differences for a second, and let's save the city and maybe the country from these people that want to invade our homeland. So he gave this speech, and everyone cheered, and then he went back to his room and he shit himself because of the dysentery, and also because the British had this enormous army against his 3,000 misfits, none of whom had ever fought a war before, like a real war. And so he's like, he knows that this is a lost cause and that he's going to die. And all of these people who he just convinced to defend the city are also going to die. And he knew what had happened in these cities on the East Coast that had been sacked and pillaged and burned, and like what the soldiers did to the families and the women of these soldiers that they've killed. And everyone was rightly freaked out by this. So around this time, Andrew Jackson, with his dysentery, gets a visit from a lawyer, a guy named Edward Livingston, who was kind of like the Saul Goodman of those days, if anyone knows Saul Goodman. This guy shows up and he says, there's another group of people who could potentially join your army. He says, who? He says, well, it's Jean Lafitte and his merry band of privateers. Look at this good-looking guy. And Andrew Jackson says, no, I don't deal with pirates. Are you kidding? They're criminals. We're not going to do this. Saul Goodman says, well, they have a bunch of cannons. He says, actually, yes. Okay, bring them on. So Jean Lafitte becomes, this is why this should be a movie. Jean Lafitte becomes a co-strategist of the defense force. So he and Andrew Jackson become the generals of this ragtag army. So now Andrew Jackson, if I haven't made it clear, I don't really like this guy. He had a lot of hate in his heart. He hated Creoles, which is basically the Spanish and French descendants, the immigrant community of New Orleans. He hated pirates because they were criminals. He hated the American Indians. He was not on the right side of history when it came to black people. He was a slave owner. And these were all the people in his army. We said, I guess this is more important for now than my personal hatred for all these people who are not like me, for whatever reason. And thus was born the most diverse army ever assembled in the history of the United States. Undermanned, outgunned, but very, very interesting ragtag group. So I want to step back and talk for a second about teams. Now I'm here, I'm going around to Google and other places to talk about this book that I just wrote that everyone who's here gets a free copy. So yeah, thanks. I hope you enjoy it. So this is one of the stories in the book. It's about teamwork. And it's about the lie we've been told our whole lives when it comes to working together and it comes to teamwork. And that lie is that two heads are better than one. Turns out that two heads are usually not better than one. And there's lots of proof for this, but despite that, we won planet Earth because we could band together. Because we were smart enough, we were equipped to collaborate. So that's how we beat all these crazy animals that were much more ferocious than us. We're smart enough to work together, to build fire, to build civilization. And so there's a reason that dogs look up to us and love us, and they're not our master. We can make a range of vocal sounds that they can't so we can communicate with each other. Even things like the whites of our eyes are 3 times the size of any other primate. So when I'm looking at something, you can tell what I'm looking at. It makes it easier for us to work on things, to collaborate, even if we can't communicate. And this, I was really proud of this one. This is a hipster and a gorilla. Our brains are equipped for empathy, which means that we can mirror the emotions of other people that we encounter. This is our brain's way of helping us to care about someone. So when someone's in trouble and they're running away from the saber-toothed tiger, we get adrenaline also. Our heart rate elevates so that we can run with them or we can fight with them. And also this empathy thing helps us to love and care about people. So we stick together with our families, and so we stick together with our tribes so we can survive. So there's all these reasons why humans are built to collaborate, or we're built to work together. But it turns out that collaborating is hard. We say that, synergy or whatever, 1 + 1 can equal more than 2. Turns out that's almost never true. They did these experiments where they asked people to yell as loud as they could, and they measured the decibels. And when you're in a room by yourself yelling as loud as you can, you'll yell a little bit louder than when you're in a room full of 6 people. And that was sort of strange. They did these other experiments where they had people pull on a rope. And it turns out that when you're doing a tug-of-war with a group of people, you exert less force on the rope, a little bit, than you do by yourself, even if you're like this kid and you think you're pulling your hardest. And some people will say, well, this is social loafing. Someone on the tug-of-war rope or someone in the yelling room is slacking off because of the group, which happens. It definitely happens. Some of this might be coordination. You have a lot of people. Coordinating is hard. The only cliche more common, I think, in business than synergy is how long it takes to turn a battleship, right? You have a lot of people, a big organization, it's hard to change. It's slow. But there's other stuff that happens that's psychological when humans come together to work together. This is my favorite series of stock photos. I like to call it White Guy Leads Brainstorm Session. So it turns out that over and over again, when researchers put people in rooms around a table to brainstorm ideas, a group of the same people, just as smart, or the same actual people, will come up with fewer ideas and fewer good ideas together in the same room than they will on their own, and then if they just add up their lists of ideas. And they've shown this so often that one famous psychologist said that business people must be insane to use brainstorming exercises. My favorite, one of their colleagues said that something like, as surely as cigarettes lead to lung cancer, brainstorming in groups leads to not as good of ideas. So it's sort of depressing, and there's lots of reasons for it. Our need to fit into the group. Sometimes it's unsafe to express certain ideas that might come to us when we're alone, when there's a group dynamic. Whatever it is, we see this phenomenon over and over and over again, that when we put our heads together, we usually don't add up to more. Maybe we add up to just as much, but we certainly don't add up to more. And then there's the other thing that happens when groups come together is we have differences. So we get in each other's faces. Our different opinions cause us to fight, to have conflict. Sometimes we even try to destroy. This is my second It's Always Sunny slide for anyone that's a fan of the show. Sometimes we try to destroy each other when we come together. But the reality is that we can't build anything big without more than one person. You can't make Google with one person. That's why we're all here, right? You can't build a building by yourself. You can't do a heart surgery by yourself. You can't even clean the stadium in time for the next game with one person. So we endure this loss of productivity that comes with group work. We endure these squabbles and these fights and the jerks that try and foil us. And then we put up walls against each other. So we say, we don't want to listen to you. We try and put our rivals and our critics on the floor, and we beat our plowshares into swords, and we turn nuclear energy, this wonderful potential power, into a bomb. And the very same thing leads to all of this. It's the differences we have between us. And yet some teams actually do manage to feel magical. And maybe some of you have felt this way when you've worked together in groups or you've been part of something where it feels like whatever you're up to, you can do the impossible. You feel infinite. And sometimes the team that isn't supposed to win overcomes the odds, and they do win. Anyone that's had a family knows that sometimes with human beings, 1 + 1 can equal more than 2, literally. And so this is how every great movement, every great breakthrough in history of society has come about. Is when different humans came together and they worked together, they linked arms and they overcame the odds. And this is important because this is what we're trying to do, not just in our work, but in general, as we're part of the team of humans that owns this planet now. But the reality is, when humans come together, we either break down or we break through. And the thing that leads to both of those things is kind of the same thing. It's the subtle interactions between our different ways of thinking. So this is the thing that I've been obsessed with over the last many years as someone who was covering innovation for magazines like Wired, and then starting my own company and realizing that we needed to work together better if we wanted to break through instead of breaking down. And it turns out that there is math behind this paradox of synergy, or the lack thereof. That those groups that do feel infinite, that do add up to more, they have something going for them that has actually been proven out in mathematical models. And so to explain this, and I promise I'll get back to the pirate story, join me at a dinner party where you've baked this delicious chocolate cake for dessert for your 8 best friends. And it's this delicious round cake, and you need to cut it into 8 equal slices. So everyone kind of knows how to do this, right? But pretend for whatever reason the knife you're using is enchanted. It's a magic party for some reason. And it's going to disappear after you make 3 cuts. So how do you make 8 slices of cake with 3 cuts? Now, some people will instantly know the answer to this, but most people, and me included, will do this. They'll attack the cake by cutting it in half like a pizza, cut it in half again, and then when you realize that you're out of cuts, your 3rd cut, if you had just one more, you could make 8. 3rd and final cut, this only makes 6 slices of cake, and 2 of your friends know you love them more than the others. So how do you solve this puzzle? How do you make 3 cuts to make 8 slices of cake? Someone? The z-axis. Yeah, yep. So some people will immediately see this. Some people say, well, you could do some curvy S calculus cuts. Can't do that because your friends need to know you love them equally. So what do? So you cut it in half again, and then you literally turn the problem on its side, the z-axis, and you cut it all the way through. Now, some of your friends get less frosting this way, but if we pretend there's frosting in the middle, then maybe they all know you love them. I like to say that if you give this puzzle to a kid, they might actually have an easier time getting it because they're this high off the ground and they look at the cake from this level. But all it takes is turning the problem around to see that there's a solution to it that makes 8 slices of cake. So this is a literal kind of fun example of what I call 1/2 of our mental toolkit, which is perspective. So when psychologists talk about perspective and neuroscientists, they say that it is the way that we encode what we encounter in the world into our own internal language. So inside of our brains, we process things and we internalize them in our own little programming language. And everyone's is a little bit different, but there are lots of things that can help us to form similar perspectives or not. So everything from where you grew up, the generation you grew up in, who you are, how you identify, to the stories, the experiences you've had in your life. So if we're walking down the street and there's a building on fire, if you've been in a burning building before, you're going to encode that situation in a different perspective than if you're a firefighter than me, who I've never had anything to do with fire. So the things we've been through in our lives help us form perspective that, if I would hazard a guess, based on you saying the z-axis, probably something in your life or training or whatever it is leads you to have that sort of 3D graph mentality sort of in your head. I don't know, are you an engineer or a mathematician? Or 3D CAD systems. Yeah, exactly. So you are used to looking at physical problems literally from 3-dimensional perspectives. So there's lots of things that form this. We'll kind of know this. There's a second half of our mental toolkit we'll go back to our party and we'll talk about this. So you have 3 glasses of milk and 3 empty glasses at this cake party. And the challenge, for whatever reason, the puzzle is you need to alternate these glasses so they go full, empty, full, empty, full, empty. So no 2 full glasses are by them next to each other. Now, how do you do this if, for whatever reason, again, magic, you can only move 1 glass? And once again, some people will instantly know the answer, and some people will take a while. And if you're like me, you think it's impossible. So most people will take the 2nd glass, and they'll move it in between these 2 glasses. And then you realize if you had one more move, you could do this. So most people will take this, and they'll move it here. There's still 2 glasses next to each other. Does anyone have the answer? Anyone know how you can move 1 glass and alternate them full empty? Were you raising your hand? No? Yes, so you take the 2nd glass and you pour it into the second to last one and then you put it down. You've only moved 1 glass. Now, I want to ask people this question and they don't get it if I tell them, pretend that you just got home from your job, your day job as a chemist. Most people will then get the answer because you realize a chemist, their job is to pour things in and out of beakers, I think. That's what we think of when we think of a chemist. What this is called, the solution to this puzzle is it's basically heuristics. So heuristics are our strategies, our approaches to solving a problem. Our rules of thumb, there's lots of different ways we refer to them. But heuristics sometimes are very connected to our perspectives. How we see something leads us to develop a different way to solve a problem or approach a problem. But often they're very detached. So heuristics come from all sorts of things, how you've had to navigate life, but also very much comes down to your education, and again, the experiences you've had, what you've been invited to do, what you've been excluded from, how you have to go navigate the world. My favorite example of this that I wrote in the book is when I talk about police work, detective work. Interviewed basically every highest-ranking female officer in law enforcement. So ATF, FBI, a bunch of homicide detectives, and all of them universally told me something really interesting, which was because I had the question of why are there so few women in law enforcement when statistics show that women shoot people wrongfully 6 times less than men do in law enforcement. So that's sort of an interesting question. You can read about it in the first chapter of the book. But most of the women I interviewed said, well, if you grow up and realize around middle school that you have less upper body strength than the boys in your class, then your solution to physical problems often is not the same thing that they do. So you encounter a locked door, instead of immediately trying to see if you can knock it down or kick it open, you actually resort to potentially trying to compromise whoever has the key or finding some way to negotiate the opening of the door. And this is not universal, but in general, if you grow up a certain way, then you develop different kinds of strategies for certain types of situations. And that's just one example, but whatever it is you've been through can be relevant to looking at a problem a different way or can be relevant to approaching a problem a different way. So the way this all comes together with the math of synergy is like this. You have this cartoon mountain range, which represents any problem you're ever working on in life. It can be represented by a range of solutions. So if we pretend that every peak on this mountain range represents a different quality of solution, the taller the peak, the better the solution, we can say any problem you encounter in life can be represented by this. There's good solutions, there's less good solutions. And whenever we're looking at a problem, we're approaching something, it's like we're hiking around this mountain range in the fog, and you get to the top of a peak, and you have to decide, do we go downhill and try and find another one, or have we found a good one? How do we navigate this? So your perspective is basically where you get dropped on the mountain range. So let's pretend this is me. I get dropped off here. You go uphill at first. You look for the closest solution to the problem. And then my heuristic is basically what I do next. So I grew up in Idaho. Let's pretend that in Idaho, in mountain climbing school, they say the rule of thumb is when you get to the top of a peak, you go down the other side, and you walk 50 paces. And if it starts going uphill by then you keep going. And if it doesn't, then you retreat back to the mountain peak you're on. You're probably in a pretty good spot. So my heuristic, basically, I go down 50 paces. I say, nope, still fog. It's going downhill. Probably have a good solution to this problem. So you can see I haven't ended up on a very good solution, but it is a solution to whatever the problem is. Now, say someone on my team has a similar perspective. She gets dropped off on the mountain. She's looking at it from the same way. We've worked together for a long time, whatever the reason for us having a similar perspective. But she has a different heuristic. She went to a different mountain climbing school than me. And so she goes uphill, and her heuristic is you get to the top of a mountain peak, go over the other side, and you hike down until you get to the trough between two mountains. And then you look and you say, which way goes up steeper? Whatever way that is, you go. So she gets down here. She says, this way is steeper. She goes up here. She gets to here, says, nope, it's not as steep. I found a better solution to the problem. Now, how teamwork usually works is if we're a good team, then she'll yell down and she'll say, hey, Shane, I found a better solution to the problem. Yay, teamwork, we got somewhere. And this is where that two heads are better than one thing comes into play. It turns out that this group is only going to be as smart as the smartest person in this group, or the person who has the right toolkit, right combination of perspective and heuristic to get the furthest. And then the rest of the group follows. And this is where we get things like best practices. So we find a solution to whatever problem it is that's good, and then we say, this is it. This is the way to do it. We all start with this perspective, and we all solve it this way. But little do we know, there is a better solution out there that we just can't get to. And in fact, our success leads to this cognitive entrenchment where we can't actually see anything else. And maybe sometimes earthquake has happened. The world has changed. There's a new mountain that we don't see. And disruption is basically when someone else finds that and leaves us on this lower mountain peak. So how the math of synergy works is someone with a different perspective. It's like someone who gets dropped off on a different part of the mountain range. And then this dude with the hat, however he navigates with his perspective and heuristic, he's going to end up somewhere. And literally in this cartoon, this works out. If we say, well, what if we tried my way, or her way, the go down to the steep part from his point of view? And if you do that, you actually end up going the steep way, and this is how the whole group can become smarter than any one person in the group, is when you combine the perspectives and the heuristics. So this is what's called cognitive diversity in psychology. Basically, the more different perspectives and heuristics we have for a problem, the more we can turn it around and potentially find solutions that are better than any group. So two heads are only better than one if they have a diverse combination of those things. So where does cognitive diversity come from? Really this cognitive mosaic that we see the world through and we navigate the world through, it's our perspectives, it's our heuristics, it's something I call how you roll, how we attack the mountain, how we operate. And this is all formed by our life experiences, the day-to-day experiences we've had, our education, our work, places we've been and lived, opportunities and exclusions we've had, people we've met, people who've helped us on our journey. This forms all of these things. And this is where we start to get into sort of work culture territory. But what forms these life experiences? Well, these are very much part of our internal and external attributes. Who we are, age, gender, race, orientation, habits, parental status, you grew up with parents or not. All these things form our life experiences, which then form our cognitive mosaic. Now, all of these things are not going to be relevant to every problem, every mountain range we work on, but many of them are, and we tend to underestimate how these different kinds of things lead us to have different ways of looking at problems. So, like I said, two heads are only better than one if those heads see things differently enough. And in the book, I get deeper into kind of this, these mathematical models for how this works, but mostly through cartoon form. But it only works if you actually combine these things. So if you have people with all this potential to find the solution to the problem, but you don't listen to the person with the other perspective on the other side of the mountain range, you say, la, 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 we're not listening, then you're not going to get there. Or even worse, if this person doesn't feel like it's safe enough to speak up about what they see and how they see the problem. Or if they say, hey, we don't care what you say, you need to fit the culture, so get down off the mountain, come over to this side and climb up here, this is the way we do things. That's the death of problem solving and innovation. But this basically explains kind of every problem in corporate America. So for any of this to work, you don't just need the different cognitive mosaics, you need cognitive friction also, which if I can go on another diversion, this is not coincidentally how we got hip hop, which is the thing that Eric and I have bonded over. So I moved to New York. I grew up in Idaho. I did not know why Notorious B.I.G. was so notorious. I did not know how to pronounce RZA. I thought it was R-Z-A. I could quote every lyric to the song Country Girl, Shake It For Me, and Fishing in the Dark. So I knew nothing about hip-hop. So I love the story of hip-hop, so forgive me if you know it. How we got hip-hop is basically this idea of cognitive friction. Started with these dance parties in the Bronx where the party was, every weekend, there would be a dance hall where they'd have two DJs. One DJ on one side, one DJ on the other side. And the game was see which DJ can get the party to dance on their side of the dance hall. So this is all about what music you brought every week, how loud your speakers were. People would show up every week and they'd do this party. And they'd pay money and the DJs were all happy. And after a while, the DJs started having these hype guys kind of announcing the next song. They try to drag people over to their side of the party. And so they'd say, hey, everybody, my DJ's got this great song. Come over here. Come dance. And then the MCs would start getting really into it, and they'd do these sort of fun couplets where they'd be like, hey, forgive me, anyone who watches this. Idaho, they'd be like, hey, ho, put your hands in the air. Come on, yo. Like that sort of thing. And one week, this guy named Busy Bee, who was sort of everyone's favorite, he was there hyping up his DJ, and he goes, ba-diddy-ba, bang-da-bang, diggy-diggy, put your hands in the air, y'all, that whole thing. And this other guy, the other DJ's hype man, his name was Cool Mo D, he, instead of doing the same thing like, hey, ho, come on, he says, now hold on, Busy Bee, I don't mean to be bold, but put that ba-diddy-ba bullshit on hold. And it's like record scratch, and everyone was like, what? And then he goes for 5 minutes just with these rhyming poetry, insulting Busy Bee and his music and his DJ, and everyone went nuts. They thought it was the greatest thing ever. So then the next week, imagine that happens to you. You don't show up the next week saying, hey, ho, ba-da-dee-ba. You come prepared. And this turned into this weekly battle of wits. And then it also turned into this weekly battle of dance. And you didn't show up every week with the same stuff as last week. You showed up ready for the battle. And Jay-Z was actually on Letterman's new Netflix show recently talking about this, and he said, this wasn't actually about destroying each other. It was all about the party. We knew that this competition, this battle, was about making this party better. We were all in on it. You wanted to win, but more people showed up. We all made more money, or everyone made more. Jay-Z was young when this happened, but that's what this was about. But it got to the point where the DJs started hacking their equipment. Grandmaster Flash soldered on a little switch into his record player to fade down the music so he could fade up music on another record. Everyone blew their minds. Everyone then tried to do that. When they started doing electronic samples, DJs would actually crack open the equipment and add more memory so they could do better samples and beat the other guy. And so out of this competition, this friction, was born not only hip-hop, but all of the genres of music that came after it, R&B and whatever the hell dubstep is. And also actual innovation in computers came from this. And so this is, again, kind of a literal example of how innovation is actually born from the friction between the different ways of our thinking. You didn't show up doing the same thing. That would have been dumb. But if it wasn't for this competition, this battle of wits, we wouldn't have got hip-hop and all the things that came with it. So I kind of chart out, if you look at potential energy between a group of people, you can sort of chart it like this, as like a rubber band. The more you stretch, the more you put tension on a rubber band, the more potential energy it has. Same thing with a group. A group of people with different perspectives and heuristics are like people pulling on a rubber band from different sides. Now, we're all afraid of the part where the rubber band snaps, right? It hurts. But if we don't go that far, then there's a lot of potential. You can shoot the rubber band really far or whatever it is. You can make a whole industry that hip-hop made. And anyone who knows the history of hip-hop knows that at some point it actually did go too far. Things got personal. There's the East Coast, West Coast thing. People actually got murdered. And the whole music industry stepped back and said, well, what are we doing this for? What is this about? Is this about elevating the party, making better music, or is this about literally trying to kill each other? So this is what we're all afraid of when we work together with people who are different than us, is this tension, this friction, which could lead to snapping or could make it an unsafe place. But this is actually the thing that gives us all the potential in the world. Combining our perspectives and our heuristics, which are shaped by our life experiences and who we are, this is how we get into this zone of possibility. And then this is where innovation happens. So in a group of people, if you're a leader, you want to get the group into this zone of cognitive friction. You want to push things out of that destruction zone. You want to depressurize things. But you want to prevent also this inertia from happening, where everyone gets along too famously, where all of our ideas, we all agree, no one is willing to speak up or to battle or be someone's intellectual opponent. And so the best leaders, the best groups, actually try and push things into this zone of possibility. So I'm going to get back to the pirate story in like 3 minutes. But the missing ingredient for any of this to work, it's great if you have cognitive diversity, it's great if you have friction, but if you're not willing to change or adapt because of it, then what is it good for, right? You can have an argument, and then if no one changes their mind, what is it for? So this thing called intellectual humility, which is kind of the last few chapters of my book, get into this idea of being able to transcend your own way of thinking, which is extremely hard, it turns out, for the human brain to do once we've become entrenched in a way of doing something. So to get at that, I want to tell a quick story about these two guys. They were two engineers that were collaborating about 100 years ago. And they basically, if you walk by their shop on any given day, you'd hear them yelling at each other. Their assistants, their neighbors were really worried that these guys were going to punch each other out or kill each other at some point. You walk by and it's screaming, yelling, arguing all the time. But then if you'd walk by their shop around lunchtime, you'd hear nothing, like quiet. But then after lunch, the screaming, yelling would start. Basically what these guys would do is they'd be working on a problem, they'd be trying to figure out the solution to something, and they'd purposely start these really intense arguments where they'd take extreme sides and really yell at each other. But then at lunchtime, they would stop, they'd eat their sandwiches, and then they would switch sides of the argument. So one guy had to argue the other guy's side, and vice versa. And this forced them to let go of their need to be right, to detach their ego from their intellect in whatever this argument was. It forced them to use a little bit of intellectual humility so they could amp up this cognitive friction. They could have these really intense debates, but it didn't matter if you lost because you were going to switch sides anyway. So it was about pushing that party forward. And this might sound like a hostile work environment if you think about yelling at your coworkers all day, but you'll forgive them when you learn that these are the two guys that invented the airplane. This is Orville and Wilbur Wright. And maybe they could actually have the fights be really intense because they were brothers. They knew that they were family, they would be okay. But they deliberately did this because they wanted to get to the top of the mountain, but they knew that when you're ready to murder Wilbur, you got to switch sides. You need to change. So this is their little trick for doing this, for unlocking this equation. So moral of the story is we need to be able to change our minds because of this stuff. We need to value the friction. We need to value the cognitive adversity if we want to get anywhere further than we can go on our own. But we need to be able to change to do it. So this, in a nutshell, explains all the reasons corporate America sucks and why we have so many problems in the world. And it's a starting point for figuring out how we can make our teams and our communities and societies better, actually leaning into these things. So speaking of impressive teams, the British Army was fucking dope. They had 20,000 troops that just beat Napoleon. And they figured out pretty quickly that Jean Lafitte wasn't going to show up to guide them through the swamp. So they're like, great, our cover's blown. But we have 7-1 odds against these misfits in this party city. They're probably all drunk anyway. So they row their boats through the swamp, and they make camp right outside of the city of New Orleans, ready to just do like a British-style ground invasion. Rows and rows of thousands of soldiers in their great outfits to just overrun the city, take over America. So that night, as they're camped out, they're getting ready for this battle. A ship a pirate ship, in fact, floats down the Mississippi River and docks right off the shore of this camp of 20,000 British soldiers. And it stops and it waits. And it does nothing. And they fired some warning shots at it. And the British decide, they're like, oh, this little tiny ship, whatever. It's probably a fisherman or some idiot. And so they go to bed. They have their sentries up, but they go to bed and they're watching it. And then the pirate ship opens fire. Start just cannons after cannons after cannons, cannonballs into the camp. They're not making a dent on this army, but this is really hard to sleep. And they have to kind of like batten down, hide in the mud. They get done with all their cannonballs. They start shooting cutlery and like random things into the camp. And so this is very annoying to the British Army, obviously. There's no way that you're going to still win 7-1 odds with this going on, but they're ruining their sleep. They're really obnoxious. And then meanwhile, anyone who ran into the woods to pee would run into this guy and get tomahawked. So these Choctaw Braves were out there basically murdering anyone who got too far away from camp. And they had taught their rivals, the dirty shirt Tennessee hunters, how to climb trees and to sit in the top of a tree and assassinate anyone who was a target, basically. So the British thought this was really unchivalrous. Again, they're not making a huge dent in the army, but this is really bad for morale. They thought it was really unchivalrous. This is not how noble wars are fought. You're supposed to line up, look each other in the eyes, and do battle. This is how war was done. So Colonel Nichols, the head of the British, he sent an envoy to Jackson that night to cordially request that they meet in the field of battle and fight like men of honor. And Jackson literally said, go fuck yourself. And so he sent this envoy back, and he was like, you're invading my land, fuck you. So in the morning, the British, demoralized, tired, their friends are being murdered in the night when they go to pee. Everyone's afraid to pee. They get up, they line up, they're like, okay, we're going to do this. So Jean Lafitte and the freemen of color had teamed up to build a moat and a dirt rampart. So they lined the city with this rampart. They built it out into the swamp kind of strategically so that you had to go over this rampart. It was only about this high, but this was their defense force. And so the British, as they're tromping through the mud, they're coming up on this. Now this is how all of the paintings show. They're like, Andrew Jackson, boldly there, no one's shooting him. When I make the movie about this, it's going to be Ryan Gosling, who is really up there manning the fort. Anyway, so what happened is the dirty shirt riflemen were waiting in the trees with their hunting rifles, and then Jackson issued everyone whiskey supplied by the pirates, and the British charge. So they line up, they charge, the defenders open fire, and it turned out that the hunting rifles that these dirty shirt riflemen had were really slow. They're not what you want in this kind of battle, but they can shoot way further than the British muskets. So they basically just assassinated all of the British leaders. They all sat on horses. They were very visible targets, and you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to do that. They did it anyway. And so the British come up, and the worst part, they were so obedient, this army, that you're supposed to take orders. You don't do anything that's, their core value was like obedience to leadership. And this one platoon of Scotsmen, the 92nd Scots, their captain yelled halt, and then he got assassinated. And so they halted, and they stayed there until like 800 of them got shot. And finally, another captain came in, and he was like, retreat, and they're like, thank God. It's like this horrible kind of case study of actually being stuck on a mountain peak that is not the optimal one, even when probably some people there could have spoke up and said, we should probably not halt right now. Anyway, so the battle was really awful. But after the smoke cleared, from the first assault, the British had lost 3,500 men. And the Americans had lost 333. So 7-1 odds against them, but 10-1 casualties in their favor. The British realized this is going to be way too hard. We're not going to make this happen. So they went home, and New Orleans threw a party. And this is the reason why we don't have the Queen on our $5 bill, is because of this. And that party hasn't stopped, by the way, in New Orleans. Because of this ragtag group of misfits that defended that city in that outrageous, overwhelming odds. So Andrew Jackson went on to become a national hero, even though he was kind of an awful person. They didn't have the internet, so they couldn't find out that he was a racist promise breaker. He stiffed his contractors, by the way. He didn't pay any of the free men of color for that, even though he promised them. But he became president anyway. Edward Livingston, Saul Goodman, became the Secretary of State. And John Lafitte was pardoned from all of his previous crimes he may have committed. So he went from stealing boats to stealing the hearts of New Orleans' beautiful married ladies. He became a man about town, sort of a local socialite. Anyway, the lesson from this story, it's not about Andrew Jackson's leadership and that speech, let's get over our differences and save the city. And it's not exactly about the British colonel's hubris and actually this really dumb approach to fighting this battle. But it's that in order to beat the odds, a team of people who are all good at their jobs and unified and similar is not nearly going to be as effective as a team with the right kinds of different ways of thinking and working together. So the different perspectives and heuristics that this ragtag army taught each other. The Choctaw Braves teaching the Dirty Shirts how to do guerrilla war and assassinations, which again is sort of ghastly. It was fighting this like an Indian skirmish. It was the pirates and their cannons and the free men of color all combining their different points of view on war that helped them win this battle. And of course, war is fought very differently now, but at the time, this was very innovative and groundbreaking. So, when Andrew Jackson says, let's set aside our differences and fight this battle, he might say, or we might say, some things are more important than our differences. Saving the city, our superordinate goal that we're trying to achieve. But I think this is an example of something that we all deep down really know. Maybe the important thing is our differences, and we should lean into that. So that's what I got. Thank you very much. And I would love to answer any questions with any little time we have left. And thank you. Is that the microphone?
It is, yes. So I guess I'll ask the first question then. Something that I've always thought about is kind of like this and first of all, thank you for coming by. Always a pleasure. In regards to culture, is like I kind of feel like it's kind of a contradiction, because we say like, hey, like Eric, like bring yourself and everything you are to our company, but then adapt to this culture. Mm-hmm. So like, how do you kind of like navigate like that acclimation period?
Yeah, I mean, I think that culture fit is actually a fairly poisonous concept. That so there's research in the 70s that they did that basically determined that we're the most happy at work when we work with people who have our same personality. And for 40 years, we've kind of conflated that with being productive and being good at solving problems together. Turns out that having the same personality is actually not very good for becoming smarter than the smartest person in your group. And being happy at work actually can be at odds with the thing that helps, which is that cognitive friction. So I think that culture fit is actually one of those things that sounds like a good idea because we want to be happy, we want to be comfortable, we want to have peace, but it's actually the intellectual battle that helps us to stretch and to become better. So I mean, I think that culture add is actually the thing that we should be talking about, and lots of people have been starting to talk about this, but there is this question of what do we need to be unified around, right? If we lean into the thing that, hey, bringing different things that are unique to the group is actually what's going to help the group if we combine it in the right ways and have the humility and all that. But then what keeps that group together? And like in this story, there was this purpose that everyone had, which was this land that we want to protect. Sort of like the aliens show up to destroy the earth, we forget about our borders, is that sort of thing. But you don't always have that in a company. But ideally, you do have a purpose of what you're trying to accomplish. But I think Google has done really well when, the core values list was basically don't be evil. It's like, no duh, like don't do wrong things. And then everyone at Google for years and years could recite, our mission is to organize the world's information. That's a pretty good purpose that if you're actually down with, then, and you leave the path to getting there as flexible as possible, then it it allows room to be that sort of band of misfits as long as you're trying to do that. I think that purpose is way more important than like a list of behaviors we want everyone to do, right? And so I think to some degree, Google is a very good example of having done that right for many, many years. Obviously, no company is perfect, and there's lots of stuff, but I think the tendency we have to say, great, you're new to the group, we value you being here, now be like this, is actually, it just squashes the benefit that we get out of it. It's like telling people to get off the mountain and go on the other side. So I think that's something important that we should talk about. At my company, we actually banned the word culture fit. Anytime someone said it, we would use it as we would sort of pause any meeting and say, all right, let's talk about how we're not going to fit. And I think that's actually kind of important. Easier said than done, but anyway, yeah.
Thank you.
I really like this microphone.
Hello. What's the difference between, like, I guess you said like the poison of like culture fit versus like you learning because you don't know anything about like the corporate life, you know, like getting used to something because you're like learning it versus like you keeping with yourself?
Yeah. So there's, you know, that whole mountain range cartoon diagram. It also applies inside of our own heads too, right? As we learn, as we gain experiences and education and work different places, we're collecting potentially different perspectives and heuristics that we can tap into. So, you know, even in your own work, it is valuable, I think, to explore as much of the mountain range as possible, right? So I think being curious about things, even if you don't find them useful, can actually be really good. You can draw lessons from them. Einstein was notoriously sort of a loner when he did his work. He had like this rival that pushed him, you know, Niels Bohr, but he had a really diverse set of inputs into his process. You know, he's at a patent office learning about all these different kinds of industries and inventions. It certainly helped, and he was curious about them. He also played the violin, he's really into drama. Those things all helped broaden his kind of potential, you know, zone of friction inside his own head. So I think, you know, you're new to an organization, actually learning how the organization does function is really important, but resisting the urge to have to fit and, you know, realizing that if the organization is smart, even if it's not, what you can bring that's outside of the normal way of thinking to provoke new ways of thinking, even if what you're bringing is not the best, you know, you're on a lower mountain peak, whatever you're bringing can help sort of explore more of that range. So I think that's important. In the book, I have a couple chapters about that idea of what often looks crazy or useless can actually be really helpful in solving problems, which is an excuse for including people who are more novices in a deliberation process or problem-solving process. With the cops thing, there's research about how when you put an old cop with a young cop, sort of like the buddy cop movie thing, that partnership will do better, just like when you put a male cop and a female cop together. Old cops tend to have a different set of perspectives and heuristics, and new cops tend to have a little bit more of that either, no, we got to do it by the book, or, well, why do we have to do it that way? And that actually helps with that process. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but I think it's all this stuff is a pragmatic excuse for doing what's sort of the right thing to do, which is including people in, you know, the more different kinds of people that we have working on things, the better chance we have of breaking through. It's also a good moral choice. So, anyone else have a, yeah.
So you talked a little bit about, like, if you're past, you had that graph where it's like, this is the area of destruction. Mm-hmm. Do you have any tips for, like, or recommendations, like, how you prevent from getting in that? I mean, is it possible that you have too much cognitive diversity, or is there other things that you do recommend to, like, not get into that area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the, is it possible to have too much cognitive diversity? You need cognitive diversity that's relevant, right? So some, like me being a pizza driver when I'm age 16 might actually not be a relevant perspective to, you know, solving like an algorithm problem or something. It might be. You want to set yourself up so you have the broadest, you know, sort of array of possibilities, but some cognitive diversity is not going to be relevant. And I think often we make decisions on who to include in a problem-solving process or on a team based on who's on the team last, right? Or who's here, who's available, or what's obvious. And I do think that that there's a very good excuse to include wildcards and you should always include people who are going to be affected by solutions to problems and all that. But you can't have too many people sitting around a table coming up with ideas, right? It's actually more ideal to have a sort of a series of one-on-one processes when you can amp up sort of the debate and the friction with different people, and it's safe and all that. But the other thing that you're asking about getting out of the destruction zone or avoiding that, right? Usually the problem that most organizations have is that you're so afraid of that you pipe down, you quiet up. You have what's called organizational silence. This is what kills mergers and marriages and everything, is when you stop talking about things that are important because you're afraid of the conflict. But there's a few things, and I get into this in the book, there's a couple of things that are sort of easy to do to reduce the tension in a relationship between people that have a lot of cognitive diversity and maybe that have fear of their differences in general. One of them is playing. So it turns out that play and humor simulates this sort of situation of anxiety, but your brain knows when you're playing or when there's a joke that it's not real and it's not actually dangerous. And so if you play with a group of people, you'll end up putting them in your psychological in-group after a while. So, and they've done all sorts of experiments in this. And another thing that I'm personally really passionate about is storytelling. The neuroscience of storytelling is something that has been recently kind of dove into by neuroeconomists. Basically, the summary is when you learn someone's story, especially you learn something vulnerable and emotional, an emotion that you can identify with, your brain generates oxytocin, which is the empathy drug, which makes you care about them. And we've done tons of experiments that basically show, and some companies like BlackRock have actually incorporated this into sort of a corporate setting. If you and I don't know each other, and maybe for whatever reason, we're nervous about each other's very different ideas or perspectives, or I grew up in a place where you would be scary to me. If I learn your story, then I'll become more comfortable, and we can actually have more of that cognitive friction between us, and it's safe. So you build trust through learning people's stories. And that thing in the New York Times a couple of years ago where it said, like, to fall in love with anyone, ask each other these 30 questions. Anyone see that? This is a really popular story. The basically is like, if you go through these 30 questions with a stranger, you will basically fall in love with them, or you'll be much more likely to have feelings for them. All of those questions are basically asking you a series of increasingly vulnerable stories about yourself. What's the last time you cried? What's something that you wish you would have done in your childhood? You can't share those kinds of stories with people without developing empathy and trust, and that allows you to go further in sort of your intellectual battle without it devolving into something personal. The Wright brothers, they loved each other and they knew each other and had this deep affection for each other. It allowed them to sort of go further. So things like that are psychological tricks that you can do. Easier to do in a team setting, in a small group of people, or in a company, and then in like society and like on Facebook, like, hey, let's all play a game so we can stop arguing about Democrats versus Republicans. Like, that's a little bit harder, but there's some real power to learning people's stories. But yeah, I mean, that's basically the game that's afoot, is how do we keep our relationships in that zone without it getting personal.
Very nice story. Do you hear me? Okay. So speaking of stories, I really love the way you started with the story and put everything
Thanks.
in that context. Wanted to ask you about that crucial step, which is people need to be flexible and be able to change their opinion in order for progress to exist. So what would you recommend doing in a setup where you see that there is resistance from certain people that they don't want to do that? And then what do you do?
Yeah, so I think if there's one skill everyone in the world could learn that would make everything better, like all of work and all of just society, it'd be intellectual humility. And intellectual humility is something that philosophers have talked about for a long time, but it's only in 2017 that we had an assessment for measuring intellectual humility. And it breaks down to a few categories. You can take, so if you go to shanesnow.com/IH, you can take like the actual test that they developed and see what areas you need to improve. So for me, separating my ego from my intellect is very hard. If you convince me I'm wrong, I will be more likely than the average person to revise my viewpoint, but it will hurt bad, because that makes me harder to collaborate with. So that's one thing. If you're dealing with someone who you know is going to be resistant, there's a few kind of tricks. You want to prime them to not get into sort of personal battle mode and to be in more intellectual battle mode. My favorite thing of late is Ben Franklin had this trick that he would do, where he knew most of the time he was the smartest person he's interacting with. But he also knew that he's not going to get better if he acted that way, and that he could be wrong. So when he was going to express an argument of something that he felt very strongly about or try to persuade someone, he'd always start with, I could be wrong, but, and then you hit them with the argument. And what that does is it primes that person to feel like it's not going to be personal if they prove you wrong. They're less on their heels when you start the argument. He'd also shy away from using absolutes like it's always or it's certainly or whatever. So there's always room for change. But for him, it helped because if you proved him wrong, he was still right. He could tell his ego, I said I could be wrong, and I was, so I'm right. And there's stuff like that you can do. I just wrote a post on in my newsletter. You can go to my website and see it, about a few other strategies for that sort of thing. Keeping your identity small, whatever things that you can do to not bring your personal ego and identity into a conversation. It's hard to force someone else to do that, but the more that you can get them to sort of see you as a human being and separate your ideas from who you are, and see that you're doing that with them, and that you're allowing them the opportunity to change your mind, that often rubs off. Some people are not going to do that, and then you got to question, are they the kind of people you want to collaborate? Maybe you just consult them, get their input, but you don't actually work with them. But there's a lot of work to be done there, but I think that's the big challenge that leaders have nowadays. We have this idea of the leader as the strong one who doesn't change, right? That can like take the bullets and lead the army or whatever. The best leaders are the ones that are going to be willing to change their minds and to be humble, basically, and not say I'm the greatest and I'm always right, even though that's the kind of people that we tend to think of as leaders, because that's who would help us, beat the saber-tooth tigers or whatever back in the day. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there, but I think that's super important. Thank you so much for coming in and listening to this. And if you end up cracking open the book and reading it, go to my website and tell me what you thought of it. Anyway, thank you.